You might not know that during the 8th century, northern England was a highly respected center of learning, producing some of the best scholars of the Middle Ages, like the Venerable Bede and Alcuin of York. Before its golden age came crashing down with the Viking raid at Lindisfarne, Northumbria was one of the most well-educated places in the world, and if you were a member of the educated elite, that is, a son or daughter of a ruler, a monk, a nun, some other member of the clergy, your education would have been intense. Fluency in Latin, for example, is not even a question. The question of what they read and what they learned specifically, however, has always been really interesting to me. Is it possible for us to attain the level of knowledge that they had? Can we read enough that we can begin to understand them? Short answer, yes, sort of. We have, luckily, a few lists by the famed scholar Alcuin of great authors that he and his students were indebted to. Using lists like these and cross-referencing them with manuscripts that come out of these monasteries and convents, we can come up with a pretty comprehensive reading list of what the average monk or nun in northern England in the 8th century would have been familiar with. Today we're going to walk through 24 books that you would have read as a member of the educated class in the early Middle Ages. I'll explain each one, talk to its significance on the time period, and give a translation recommendation where possible. Stay tuned. We'll begin with the single most important text to the early Middle Ages, St. Jerome's Latin translation of the Bible, commonly referred to as the Vulgate, from Latin vulgatus, meaning made public, made common. When Jerome wrote this translation in the late 4th century, it was indeed for the public who spoke Latin. 3 centuries later, however, not so much, and consequently, by the 8th century, the education of Latin had become extremely important for the Church in Western Europe. Within the Bible, the most influential books on this time period are Genesis, Exodus, the Psalms, and the Gospels. These are the texts we see translated most frequently into the vernacular, being here Old English, and are most commonly referenced in passing in the writings of the time. The Bible was seen not only as a compilation of God's commandments, but an authoritative text on understanding the world, which could be mined for wisdom and spiritual guidance at the peril of the reader. We know from some scholars, notably Alberich of Ancient, that there were disputes within the early medieval English church over interpretations of the Old Testament texts. If Jacob could have 4 wives, does that mean polygamy is okay? Short answer, no. Genesis was considered a very spiritual and metaphorical text that took a great deal of thinking to understand. The Gospels, however, one could interpret more literally. The Psalms were guides to prayer, many of which would have been memorized and recited throughout the day by the religious clergy. If you want your own copy of the Vulgate, I recommend the Dumbarton Oaks Facing Page edition. It's in several volumes, so if you only want to buy the most important ones, I recommend in order the New Testament, the Pentateuch, and the poetical books. St. Augustine is arguably the most important Christian philosopher ever, excluding St. Paul or Christ himself, and his writings were hugely popular in the medieval church. The Confessions constitutes probably the most significant of these writings, being Augustine's autobiography and a really moving meditation on the spiritual life. Augustine's Confessions are known for being extremely self-aware, introspective, and honest. He can say with remarkable lucidity why he felt tempted by a desire to sin in any given instance, why he caved into that temptation, and how it made him feel in the moment and immediately afterwards. It is then a guide to and one of the first examples of the interior life of the contemplative Christian. The reader is encouraged less to remark on Augustine's life and conversion, and more to consider their own actions, their own thoughts, why they do the things that they do. It's the kind of text that really can't be read academically. It's almost an invitation to self-reflection and self-awareness. The Loeb Classical Library sells the Confessions in 2 volumes with a relatively new facing page translation. This is the edition that I have and the one that I recommend, if you'd like to read it too. The Consolation of Philosophy, written in the early 6th century, is a fascinating meditation on the unpredictable nature of fortune, the role of mankind in the universe, and the question of free will. The most interesting part of the book is the nature of its creation. Boethius, who has been sentenced to death for being on the wrong side of a political dispute under the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great, is awaiting his execution on house arrest. In this setting, he writes a dialogue between himself and a woman he names Philosophy, who chastises him for mourning his impending doom, and proceeds via argumentation to walk him out of a state of misery and into a state of stoic acceptance and contemplation. Hence the title, The Consolation of Philosophy. Shortly after finishing the work, Boethius's sentence is indeed upheld, and he is executed. The appeal to this work is not just that it's a sober contemplation of impending death by someone who is actually about to die, but also the extremely insightful and learned meditation the reader is treated to on some of life's most important questions. His Christian packaging of Stoicism was extremely popular and has been ostensibly influential on, for example, King Alfred the Great, Chaucer, and C.S. Lewis. I would say a plurality of Christian theologians, even today, still use his framework to talk about free will and providence. Along with the Confessions, this is another truly timeless work that really personally invites the reader to self-reflection and inspired contemplation on the universe. If you're interested in reading it yourself, I like the lobe-facing page translation. If you want specifically a medieval English take on the Consolation, consider the translation into Old English accredited to King Alfred the Great, which Dumbarton Oaks has a facing page edition of. As a monk or nun in the 8th century, this would probably not have been required reading, unless you were going to be in charge of other people, in which case it would have been tantamount. Gregory's treatise on pastoral care is essentially a guideline to leadership in the Catholic Church and sets an extremely high standard for anyone who finds themselves in a position of power. He makes a very long and impassioned exhortation to humility, education, self-awareness, prayer. His insights are urgent, and he has damning words for abusive and ignorant leaders. While he is specifically speaking in a religious context, this text has a lot of applicability to anyone in charge of anything, and it goes a long way towards explaining some of the anxieties in medieval church leadership. Unhappily, the standards Gregory sets are sometimes considered cumbersome, confusing, or plainly too high, and therefore are often not followed at all. No further comment there. This text was brought to England with the second advent of Christianity and the mission of St. Augustine of Canterbury, and it remained important in early medieval England, notably being translated in the court of King Alfred. Ever since St. Paul opined that the unmarried life was better in 1 Corinthians 7, the Church has had fluctuating opinions on the virtue of chastity. But by the early Middle Ages, the monastic orders at least were completely chaste, and among men and women alike, the life of abstinence was a big deal. St. Aldhelm, one of the first Anglo-Saxon writers, period, was a fervent advocate for celibacy, and accordingly wrote an opus geminatum, meaning two works that are really parallel and closely related, titled De Laude Virginitatis, on the praise of virginity, to his contemporary, the abbess St. Hildeleith. There's a prose version and a poetic version, both of which recount all of the benefits of celibacy, giving examples of famous virgins of history, and concluding in the poetic version with a battle between the virtues and the vices. Aldhelm's Latin is extremely difficult, but very unique and colorful. If anyone out there thinks that they're well educated in the Latin language, I challenge you to read the poetic De Laude Virginitatis. For readers with the aptitude, it's really fun and colorful. It's just difficult. Before we move on to the more technical textbook education, it's important to clarify what these monks, nuns, and educated young men and women would have been reading or listening to for entertainment. As much as some people at the time would have preferred otherwise, poetry was extremely popular among the educated elite in medieval Europe, and sometimes the best poetry doesn't exactly come from Christian sources. Virgil's Aeneid is probably, behind only the Bible, the second most important text to the Middle Ages, full stop. It's actually unbelievable how widely this epic poem about a Roman hero was not only read, but also memorized in massive chunks and recited for fun by the Christian clergy. And it's not hard to see why. With the Aeneid, you get something amazing at every level of inspection. At the smallest, the meter is expertly crafted dactylic hexameters, so good that most people who wrote in dactylic hexameter afterwards were honestly just trying their best to copy Virgil. Take a step out from that, and you get really compelling characters and dialogue, most notably the Queen of Carthage, Dido, whose failed romance with Aeneas is one of the most studied stories in human history. Take a step out from that, and you get a really thought-provoking picture of humanity. I'm not an expert on Aeneid studies, and I don't know much more about the poem beyond my own personal thoughts, so I'll stop there. But it might suffice to say that 9 out of 10 educated scholars of the Middle Ages had not only read the Aeneid, but absolutely loved and cultivated it in a way that's perhaps only comparable nowadays to the way people treat Lord of the Rings. And if Virgil's Aeneid is Lord of the Rings, Lucan's Pharsalia is Game of Thrones. This is the bloody, gruesome, uncomfortable foil epic written about the war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, which led to Caesar declaring himself dictator and being subsequently assassinated. Lucan was a child prodigy, and enormous pressure was placed on him from a young age to become the next Virgil. The pressure, perhaps, was too much, and what Lucan ended up producing was one of the most disturbing and violent expressions of anxiety and horror that I have ever seen in art. The descriptions are so vivid, the reader can almost see the atrocities being committed before their eyes. The pages are practically dripping with blood. And yet, there are occasional moments of absolute sublimity, when after 9 books of nightmarish terror, Pompey dies, and his soul briefly flies into the heavens, and we get a truly beautiful moment of clear serenity, wherein Pompey laughs at the world. There's nothing they can do to him anymore. He's free. This kind of thing, the liberation of the soul from the hellish corporeal world, was extremely appealing to medieval scholars, and for them it reflected the Christian truth of life after death. We know that this scene in particular gets a lot of attention because it actually gets copied into Boccaccio's Teseida, as well as Chaucer's Troilus and Cressida. I really liked the Loeb edition, and I would recommend it to anyone who is interested in reading it. A poet lesser known to us, but not much lesser known to scholars of the early Middle Ages, was Statius, who is most famous for his Thebaid poem. This epic tells the story of a succession war between 2 brothers, Eteocles and Polynices, the sons of Oedipus, fighting for the throne of Thebes. After a long 12 books, the poem concludes in abject disaster, as basically everyone dies, and Theseus has to march in and clean up the mess. The Thebaid is a really depressing story, and similarly to in the Pharsalia, one feels an almost apocalyptic pressure building throughout the entire work. As you can imagine, then, this probably spoke to the constant fear of impending death and destruction felt in the mind of the median inhabitant of late antiquity and early medieval Europe, which was arguably one of the most violent periods in human history. Tragedy has always been most impactful to people who can actually understand loss. Saint Fortunatus is one of many Christian Latin poets who were extremely influential in the early medieval church, which was really struggling to justify its love for Latin poetry with its desire to be holy. If we're all trying to get to heaven, how does reading pagan poets help us? The solution is to write good Latin poetry about Christian topics, right? Well, while this kind of solution in church history has at times been extremely effective, like in the case of Cadimon's hymn, the Christian Latin poets never really did equal the popularity of Virgil and Lucan. Fortunatus is a rare example of one of them attaining widespread success and respect, and his works were pretty well known. The example poem I picked for this, Pange lingua gloriosi proelium certaminis, is a beautiful reflection on the crucifixion. Catholics might recognize it as a protoform of the Pange lingua gloriosi corporis mysterium written by St. Thomas Aquinas. If you want to read the poem yourself, it's not that long, and you can find it with a translation on Wikipedia. For Anglo-Saxon clergy, stories like Beowulf would have fallen a little closer to forbidden literature. It would have varied person to person, but there was much less forgiveness for pagan poetry in the vernacular than for pagan poetry in Latin. A well-known example of this is a letter that Alcuin wrote to Bishop Hebald of Lindisfarne, complaining that he had heard of pagan poems being told in the monastery. His famous line was, "Quid ingeldus cum Christo?" What does ingeld, a character mentioned in Beowulf, have to do with Christ? But precisely because Alcuin had this complaint, we know that not everyone thought this way, and that many monks and nuns would have still maintained an interest in their own mythology. I chose the poem Beowulf in particular, not because it's the most famous Old English poem, but because Beowulf is clearly a passionately Christian poem, and the poet has a deliberate motivation towards evangelization. So, maybe it would have been more accepted for that reason. Either way, it's a beautiful poem, and an enlightened meditation on the inevitability of age and death. If you're going to understand the early medieval English mind, you should read Beowulf. For a number of reasons, I recommend Tom Shippey's facing page translation. If you want to know why, check out the video I made on that topic. For an introduction to the general Anglo-Saxon pagan legendarium, check out my video on the Deor poem, which tells a couple more of these stories that the average person in the 8th century probably would have known well. Moving on to historical education, Orosius, who was a student of Augustine of Hippo, wrote an extremely influential History Against the Pagans, a parallel work to Augustine's own City of God Against the Pagans, the thrust of which was to demonstrate that the decline of the Roman Empire could not, as was seemingly proposed, be attributed to the advent of Christianity, which was sometimes viewed as a foreign, effeminizing force on Roman politics. On the contrary, according to Orosius, all of human history has always been wicked and bloody and cruel. This is nothing new, so don't blame us. It's full of sarcastic remarks like saying that Leonidas promised the Spartans that things would get better. Get better, huh? That's odd because people nowadays act like things back then couldn't have been better, etc. Aside from the polemical slant, the book does have a vague degree of historical accuracy and was relied upon as a veritable history of classical antiquity for large parts of the Middle Ages. This, in part, contributes to the aggrandizement of figures like Alexander the Great and Leonidas, who seem to fight larger quantities of Persians every time someone writes the story. The Venerable Bede was a legend in Northern Europe, in life and in death, and his writings were in high demand in the 8th century. His most significant work was the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, which gives a long and remarkably accurate account of the history of Christianity in the British Isles. Unlike other scholars of the time, Bede was clearly very careful about wanting to get the facts right, which has made him one of our best sources for early medieval English history. It also made him revered in his own time, and doubtless as soon as it was finished, his history became mandatory learning for the educated elite in England. It's pretty likely that in the mid-8th century, history lectures were given from Orosius, Augustine, and Bede in conjunction, with a bit of explanatory work to synthesize them all. Bede's Latin is so good that he's actually given a special place as a non-classical author in the Loeb Library. I'm a fan of their edition of his history, and I would recommend it if you're interested. We have really specific instructions from the early medieval period on how a liberal arts education should be carried out, and this is sometimes referred to as the Trivium and the Quadrivium, the two stages of learning, where at first you focus on grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the three pillars of the Trivium, and then once you've mastered those, you learn arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the four pillars of the Quadrivium. The rest of the texts that I want to cover today fit into these categories pretty well. Speaking of categories, any discussion on Western thought whatsoever has to mention Aristotle. Due to the rarity of Greek learning in the West in the Middle Ages, Aristotle wasn't as strongly cultivated in philosophical studies as he is now, and only the most elite and well-learned scholars could even read him. But those that could latched onto his ideas and eagerly incorporated them into their philosophical frameworks. One work we know was popular among the educated of Anglo-Saxon England was the Categories. Aristotle sought to categorize every concept imaginable into 10 options, like for example a substance, a position, or a condition. This is one of the first places we see words like synonym being used, and it's a seminal work on grammar, logic, and concepts like the subject and the predicate of any given proposition. My Greek isn't good enough to give you an authoritative opinion on a translation to read, but the Loeb Library does have an edition, and they haven't let me down yet. The Latin statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero is typically considered the best Latinist of all time, and his works on philosophy and rhetoric were well preserved and well studied in the early Middle Ages. In this fun text, a very young Cicero attempts to defend rhetoric as an art against the notion that because it has the ability to manipulate the attractiveness of an argument regardless of veracity, it is therefore a wicked art. After rebutting this claim by saying that only through rhetoric can humanity escape a sort of animalistic might makes right sort of civilization, Cicero goes on to explain the 5 tenets of rhetoric, being invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. And then he gives a guide to the first of these, invention, hence the title. It seems at one point that he planned on writing a book for all 5 tenets, but if he did, we don't have them. Cicero actually wrote a fuller and more mature account of rhetoric later in his life, De Oratore, but that text wasn't really discovered until the 15th century, and so in the 8th century, De Inventione was all that was available. Like all of Cicero's works, if you'd like a physical copy with a facing page translation, there is always the Loeb. My friend Corey does pretty good readings in Latin from De Inventione, and I'll have his channel linked in the description. Servius was an extremely well-educated Italian scholar of late antiquity, who wrote an absolutely massive commentary on the Aeneid, explaining and elaborating on practically every line. His insights are really educational and provide a working understanding of a lot of rhetorical devices. In the commentary on the very first word, for example, arma, he explains that this is metonymy. Virgil is obviously not just going to sing about weapons, he is going to sing about what is done with those weapons, i.e. war. It's one of the first examples of a scholarly commentary, and while there's unfortunately no English translation that I know of, anyone who has the Latin aptitude, or honestly just access to Google Translate, should really check it out. Priscian is one of the first grammarians in the modern sense of the word, and alongside the older Donatus, whose works are also popular in early medieval Europe, develops the first comprehensive framework for discussing the Latin language. That is, Donatus writes what might be called the first grammar, and if it isn't the first grammar when Donatus writes it, it is the first grammar when Priscian writes it. This is where we really begin to see terms like noun, plural, nominative, indicative, pluperfect, etc., all being used in the modern sense. This lens of looking at language was really fascinating to Anglo-Saxon scholars, and we actually get a really cool translation into Old English in the late 10th century by Alberich of Ancient. Isidore's etymologies constitute what we might call the first scholarly philological text in the West. Not only does he provide a framework of learning, following the example of so many thinkers of the time and outlining the liberal arts, but he also goes through a huge body of words and explains why they're called what they're called. As cool as it is, most of it is complete nonsense, like claims that the lamb is called agnus because it recognizes Latin agnoscere, its mother at birth. Others, however, are totally correct, like the fact that the word rhinoceros just means nose-horned in Greek. Like with grammar, the knowledge, or at least the supposed knowledge, of etymology was seen as a crucial part of the study of logic and rhetoric, and Isidore's work was widely read in the 8th century. There's a great translation of this massive work by Barney, Lewis, Beach, and Berghoff, published in 2010, that I would recommend to people looking to read this book. I'll talk about 2 pieces from Alcuin himself now, the first of which was designed for the education of Pepin, son of Charlemagne, who was 5 years old when Alcuin began teaching him in 782 AD. Alcuin desired greatly to instill in Pepin a clear metaphysical understanding of the world, and to do that, he set about having Pepin memorize a slew of gnomic questions and answers, titled The Discussion of the Royal and Most Noble Youth Pepin with Alcuin the Schoolmaster. These questions are wide-ranging, and their answers might not be immediately obvious. I'll give you a few examples. Quid est littera? What is a letter? Custos historiae, the guardian of history, obviously. Quid est verbum? What is a word? Proditor animi, the traitor to the mind, obviously. Quis generat verbum? What generates a word? Lingua, the tongue, of course. Alcuin is actually not making this stuff up either. He's largely borrowing from an existing tradition of question and answer dialogue in this style, and his seems to be based very closely off of an anonymous dialogue from the 2nd century, attributed to Epictetus and Emperor Hadrian. Alcuin likely followed this example in the hope that as he was mirroring Epictetus, so too might Pippin one day grow to be another Hadrian. I encourage you to go through some of these. There are a couple English translations that can be found online, and it's really interesting stuff. The most explicitly logical text on this list is Alcuin's Problems to Sharpen the Youth, which is a series of 50 or so logic puzzles that he wrote, likely also for Pepin's education. Some of these are pretty famous, like the problem of the wolf, the sheep, and the cabbage. You need to transport a wolf, a sheep, and a cabbage across a river in a boat where you can only carry one of them at a time. If you leave the wolf and the sheep together alone, the wolf will eat the sheep. If you leave the sheep and the cabbage together alone, the sheep will eat the cabbage. How can you get all three of them in one piece to cross the river? There's also the harder question of the jars. A man has died and left his 3 sons 30 glass jars. 10 of them are full of oil, 10 of them are half full of oil, and 10 of them are empty. Each son needs to get an equal share of oil and glass. How can you divide these 30 jars so that each son gets his equal portion? Being able to answer these questions in the 8th century would have separated you from the unlearned masses and signaled that you had received training in logic, an essential part of the liberal arts. So, as the last group of texts was centered on rhetoric, grammar, and logic, the Trivium, this final group gives you something of an education on the higher disciplines of the Quadrivium, being astronomy, arithmetic, geometry, and music. One very unique text written by Cicero is the Dream of Scipio Aemilianus, in which the Roman general and adopted son of Scipio Africanus has a vision of himself ascending into the heavens, much like Pompey's vision in Lucan's Pharsalia, where he sees his then dead adopted father, as well as the 9 spheres, which are, of course, Earth, motionless, at the center of the universe, then the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and then the stars, which constitutes heaven. According to Cicero, all of these spheres make music, which reflects the perfect harmony of the universe, imperceptible to us mortals here on Earth. Cicero isn't just making this stuff up either, he's largely borrowing and expanding upon material from Plato. But Plato is not well known in the Middle Ages, Cicero is. And this text becomes hugely popular as one that not only explains the heavens, but also seems to be pointing towards the monotheistic truth that Christians thought all wise thinkers could discern, even if they were pagan, like Cicero. The Somnium can be found in modern editions as the 6th book in Cicero's work De Re Publica concerning the Republic, and there is, of course, a lobe of that out there if anyone wants it. The Natural History is an absolutely gigantic encyclopedia of Roman knowledge, according, of course, to the statesman Pliny the Elder. It explains various fields of the liberal arts, such as astronomy and mathematics, in good detail, but it also wanders around the field of human knowledge in general, talking about the nature of animals, rocks, plants, art, people, and more. One of the more famous aspects of the natural history is the discussion on faraway peoples and monsters, like the sciapods, Greek shadow feet, who only have one giant leg and one giant foot, which they sit under during the day for shade. They are the inspiration for C.S. Lewis's Dufflepuds. Our same Boethius from earlier, before he was arrested and executed, wrote 2 books on arithmetic and 5 books on music, all of which survive into the early Middle Ages and get used as educational resources. Here, Boethius is largely just translating the works of Nicomachus, who was himself borrowing from Plato and Pythagoras, and on the mathematical side, the arithmetic in Boethius's books is more like an explanation of the logic and philosophy of mathematics than a book of practice problems. On the musical side, also a translation from Nicomachus, Boethius gives us a really fascinating picture into the attempts of late antiquity to give a logical and mathematical explanation for why and how we enjoy music. There's a lot said, including a reference to the same music of the universe we hear about in the Somnium Scipionis, But one thing that we see is the Pythagorean music theory advocated for by Boethius is an obsession with intervals. For example, the perfect fourth, which sounds like this, and the perfect fifth, which sounds like this. Predictably, then, we see a lot of medieval music absolutely dominated by the presence of these chords. We'll finish up our list with a technical treatise from Bede on the calculation of time. This was an extremely important skill because the management and keeping of systems of time was absolutely necessary to the running of a state, and there were comparatively very few people who could do it, namely the educated elite. This wasn't just because they wanted to gatekeep this information either. Before our modern calendar system, which itself is made much easier by global communication and the internet and mass media, the measuring out of the year was an extremely mathematical and laborious process, and you had to be trained and educated on how to do it. This is, in some ways, the culmination of all this logical and arithmetical training that we've been discussing. Bede really gives a tour de force of liberal arts education, explaining everything from how to count on your fingers to the Greek months of the year, the equinoxes, the behavior of the moon, and what we know will happen in the future. That's all that I have for today. 24 books that if you read, you will attain, at least to some degree, the level of knowledge that the average scholar in Northern England in the 8th century was at. If you liked this video, be sure to check out the rest of my channel. If you really liked it, then kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon. And until next time, Farathye Yesunde.